So if you take out a mortgage and buy a house, pay 7% mortgage today, you take out a 30-year mortgage, what did the bank get out of that? They already get it back in 10 years. And in 20 years, it doubled again. And in 30 years, it's quadrupled. I mean, so you see how rapidly the increase in debt service is, and the Babylonians knew that.
Economics as a profession, you know what? It peaked 3,800 years ago because societies in antiquity understood that usury would grow without limit while production in society would plateau.
They knew that you had the S-curve of herds growing, you knew the exponential growth of debt, and you see the difference. From that alone, they knew it's obvious that the debts can't be paid. If you don't cancel them, you're going to have a domestic oligarchy growing. Now, every introductory Economics 101 course should have that model.
It didn't take the tribal leaders, the priests, or the kings of great antiquity too long to figure out that debt peonage was bad for a lot of different reasons. The population could revolt. The population could flee and come back a few generations later as nomad hordes to overthrow the kingdom. There was one other problem for kingdoms that allowed the bulk of their male population to slide into debt bondage.
They said, if we don't cancel the debts, then the debtors are going to fall into bondage to the creditors, as you can read in the Bible, and then nobody's going to fight in the army and will be defeated. And so in order to keep a land-tenured army, we have to return the land to the people who've lost them to the creditors. We have to free them from bondage. Otherwise, everybody's going to leave, there will be depopulation, and we'll be defeated.
These men couldn't fight to defend the nation. Clergy, chieftains, the ruling classes of these societies in antiquity were generally smart enough to figure out this was not good for their own health. So surely today we've got to be lots smarter because we have more mathematical tools, we have computers, we have system dynamics, we have technology, science. Well, we have the conservative schools of economic thinking who believe that production can grow without limit, and that private debt, usurious debt, the stuff of home loans, credit cards, student debt, car debt, medical debt, all that's just dandy. And all of which happened to start taking off with the emergence of neoliberalism, which happens to encourage policies that favors the concentration of wealth from the many into the hands of the few. But what about the heterodox community? Aren't they fighting the good fight? Yes, they're fighting a good fight. They are disabusing policymakers of the idea that a currency sovereign goes into debt when it deficit spends. But there's something missing in this conversation. They ignore what the Babylonians and the Sumerians understood. They ignore what Michael Hudson understands. Usury, the charging of interest rates, is a pure wealth transfer from the many to the few. And it is a fundamental driver of wealth inequality and of social instability. But we have one more tiny little topic to cover here. Inflation. Yes, sirree, Bob, is just another version of highway robbery, wealth transfer from the many to the few. Think of it as a tribute or a tax that you can't do anything about. That mainstream economists full in on interest in inflation isn't at all surprising. They are water boys for oligarchy. And oligarchy is all about forcing the population into debt peonage. It's kind of their thing. It's all about interest in inflation, baby. And you'd think the free-thinking, rebel, heterodox community would take an extremely dim view over the extortionist wealth transfer from the many to the few due to the coupled consequences of interest and inflation. Because each amplifies the effects of the other. That's quite easy to see because inflation raises the total amount of money people are often forced to borrow. And thanks to the Fed, they are also forced to hand over even more of their existing income with elevated interest rates. For all intents and purposes, the heterodox community, they're just a bunch of neoclassicals in this area. Because they just love the idea of inflicting a 3 to 5% inflation on the general population, because that will enhance the velocity of money. Yeah, right, because a population that's largely forced to already hand over most of their income to service debt really needs an incentive to spend the 2 or 3 cents they have left over. And it gets even better than that, because that constant price pressure, often forces people at the edge of financial insolvency to take on loans in order to cover emergency costs, or they're just pushed into bankruptcy, allowing the very wealthiest people to come in and pick up their properties for pennies on the dollar. Yeah, so brilliant strategic thinking on the heterodox community's grasp of the consequences of interest and inflation on the population. Brilliant work, guys. And I'm sure some waif will come in and say, well, we can just apply debt jubilees, just like the Babylonians. I got a problem with that. You're applying a tourniquet after the victim has already been bled of a great deal of their economic blood.
He's dead.
And this is why I say, with the exception of a very few individuals, there has been nothing interesting developed in economics in 3,800 years, because neither interest nor inflation are necessary for their marquee functions. You don't need interest or inflation to incentivize people to lend out their spare money or precipitate a debt deflation cycle by hoarding it. We already got the debt deflation cycle by having to pay money to service debt. This answer is straightforward: a demurrage tax, which happens, by the way, not to be like inflation, because inflation devalues the purchasing power of money. Tax, by definition, increases the spending power of the remaining money in the economy, which, if the government needs to, can just infuse a bit more as needed. And because interest in inflation necessitates growth in an economy, putting an end to these phenomena in an economy is a small matter of human survival.